Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Steinhusen. I am the festival director and very excited to welcome you to our romance panel. So we're sharing our amazing authors and stories from the St. Albert Public Library, which sits on Treaty 6 territory, traditional land of First Nations and Métis people. So this is a virtual event. But we want it to be an interactive event. So please, there's plenty of opportunity to ask questions. You can actually post your questions throughout the evening. Just make sure to change your chat settings to say everyone instead of host and panelists. And like I said, put your comments throughout the evening. We'll collect them all. If you haven't had a chance to purchase any of the novels, we're going to provide links in the chat to where you can find them, and we do have the books at the library. So without further ado, I have a lot of people to introduce. This is our first romance panel at Starfest, and I'm very excited. It's long overdue. So I'm going to actually introduce the panelists in alphabetical order and then our lovely moderator. So we'll start with Courtney Milan. She's the author of over 20 novels. I stopped counting at 20 when I looked it up. So before she started writing romance, Courtney got a graduate degree in theoretical physical chemistry from UC Berkeley. After that, just to shake things up, she went to law school at the University of Michigan and graduated summa cum laude. Then she did a handful of clerkships. She was a law professor for a while, and now she writes books about carriages, corsets, and smartwatches full-time. She lives in the Rocky Mountains with her husband and an exceptionally perfect dog. We may be able to hear the perfect dog this evening. Farah Heron's debut, The Chai Factor, was named one of the summer's best books by the Globe and Mail and was praised in Book Riot, Smart Bitches, Trashy Books, Bustle, and more. Her next release, Accidentally Engaged, was praised in Entertainment Weekly, USA Today, NPR, The Toronto Star, Glamour, and Oprah Magazine. Her young adult debut, Tahira in Bloom, will be out on November 1st, so very, very shortly. And her next adult release will be Camilla Knows Best, coming out March 8th, 2022. So that is Farah. And Uzma Jalaluddin is the author of Aisha at Last and Hannah Khan Carries On. That second one kept me up until about 1:30 last night. So if I'm look a little tired around the eyes, it's Uzma's fault. She's a high school teacher and also a Toronto Star columnist and contributor to The Atlantic. Her first novel, Aisha at Last, was published in the US, the UK, Australia, and India, and was optioned for film by Amy Pascal and Sony Pictures, which is very exciting. So that is our esteemed panel, and now I am going to introduce our esteemed moderator. Guyanese-Canadian author Natasha Deen was the inaugural regional writer-in-residence for the Metro Federation Writers in Residence program. That is how we met. Her YA novel, In the Key of Niragani, won the 2020 Amy Mathers Award. When she's not writing, she teaches Introduction to Children's Writing with the University of Toronto SCS and spends an inordinate amount of time. I did stay up until 1:30. I apologize, everyone. Trying to convince her pets that she's the boss of the house. I'm very excited to pass things over to Natasha. I'm looking forward to a fun and possibly steamy evening. So thank you, everyone. I leave it to you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. Very excited to be here. We have the hour and we've got tons of questions. We're really looking forward to the audience questions as well. So we're going to get started with the Fast Five. So these are the 5 most sort of common questions that writers get asked. So Farah, I'm going to start with you. How long have you been a writer? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. First answer for your Fast Five is 5 years. I've been writing for 5 years.
Right, for 5 years. Where do you get your story ideas?
I'm usually inspired when I'm reading other books. I get ideas just flying into my head that are usually nothing like the book I'm reading. And that sometimes tells me that maybe that book isn't the right book for me to be reading right now, because if it's an amazing book, then my mind stays on that book instead of something else.
That's well said. How long does it take you to finish a book?
That completely depends. My debut took me 2 weeks to write the first draft, and then my next book took me 6 months. So it's all over the place.
2 weeks. That's
That
amazing.
was an intense
That's
2 weeks. It was intense.
Do you have a favorite book that you've written?
Probably whatever the book I'm working on right now.
Yeah.
I don't have just like my kids. I don't have a favorite kid. I don't have a favorite book, but the book I'm working on right now is always my favorite.
I feel like that's for a lot of writers, right? Because if it's not your favorite, then you're not going to spend the time on it.
That's
right?
exactly right. Yeah.
And it can be a grind. It's not always done in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, like oh
2
my
weeks, I
gosh.
know.
And so, do you have a favorite book that you have read?
I always go back to Pride and Prejudice when I'm stuck. I'm an old school Austen nerd. But my next adult book is actually an Austen retelling, and it is Emma. So I've been rereading Emma a lot while I was writing that. So I think Emma might be topping Pride and Prejudice for the first time in my life.
Wow, well done. Well done. All right, Courtney, let's go to you. How long have you been a writer? 20 books.
I think I started writing romance in 2006, and I guess that's 15 years, which seems like a lot. It's a very big number. I'm not used to having a large number like that.
Yeah. All right. And then where do you get your story ideas?
Literally everywhere.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite spot? Like, or a favorite like go-to?
No, I'm at the point where I just actively wish I would stop getting them, because I can't possibly write the ones I have in this lifetime. So.
And so have you done a 2-week book? How long does it take for you to finish a book?
Okay, somewhere between 2 months at the low side to get like for the first draft, and then edits take longer. 2 months at the low side, up to 6 years and counting.
Yeah.
So,
yes. Stories grow at different rates, right?
They do.
Yeah.
They do. And sometimes you grow at different rates, and you can start a book and not realize that you're not ready to write it. So.
Yeah, wow, that's well said. That's really well said. And so are you also in the camp of whatever book you're writing right now is your favorite book?
I'm the opposite. Whatever book I'm writing right now is my least favorite, and I can only see flaws. And I'll publish it, and I'll just be like, well, anyone who likes it, I don't know what, they're just bad taste. Right? I can't say that out loud. I just did, so I guess I ruined that. But you shouldn't say that out loud. But when I'm working on it, I always see only flaws. And then the other day I had to go back through something that I wrote 10 years ago. For some, it was like some marketing thing or whatever. I was pulling quotes from it, and I started reading bits and pieces. I was like, this is actually good. What the heck? When did that happen? I don't know. So.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I once my books are published, I can't go back to and read them. Because all I see is the ways that I could have changed it, made it a little better. Oh, I should have used this word, right? Like that ruins the whole book now. I've used the wrong word. Like forget everything else. Right?
Yep.
And then what about a favorite book to read? Do you have like one that you kind of go back to when you just want to refill the well?
It comes and goes depending on my mood. Right now, I've just been in a mood where I'm not reading a lot of romance for whatever reason, even though I often do. And so I've been rereading the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, which, by the way, I don't think it aged well in some portions, but the TV show is coming up, and it's kind of interesting to revisit something that I really enjoyed when I was 16. That's when I started, and seeing it come around. So.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you to both you and Farah. Uzma, the spotlight is now on you. How long have you been a writer?
I've been publishing since probably 2017. So 4 years, is that 4 years? But I've been I've been a writer probably my entire life, but I've been actively pursuing writing since maybe 10 years.
Nice. Very nice. Because you're also an English teacher, yes, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. And where do you get your story ideas?
I'm with Courtney all over the place when I'm doing the dishes, when I'm going for a walk, when I'm out for dinner with my husband, just everywhere.
I feel like as a high school teacher, walking down the hallway, getting those half snippets of conversation, right?
No.
I feel like, no.
No, it's funny. Everyone always asks me like, why haven't you written YA yet? And I've lately, very recently, and maybe in the past couple months, been toying with the idea. But
Yeah.
I feel like because I spend so much of my life with teenagers, I don't want to bring them home with me. I'm just like, I'm really not interested in their life. That might change, but that's work, and this is my other job. So
Yeah, that's fair. That's
Yeah.
fair. And about how long does it take for you to finish a book?
oh, forever. I'm such a slow writer. My first book took me like 8 years, something really embarrassing like that. And then Hannah Khan, my second, I've published two. My second book took about 2 years. So that was improvement. And I'm in the middle of drafting my third, and I'm about 6 months into it, and I'm almost done. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
You're I feel like you're at your momentum, right? Like
Yeah.
you're gaining a lot of it. That's
Mind you,
amazing.
it's just the first draft. So I guess that is still very slow, because by the time I finish, it'll be a year, I'm sure.
It's still writing. It's still right. And it's still faster than a year. So it still
yeah.
counts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you have a favorite book of the two that you've written?
No, I think I'm more like Courtney. The book that I'm writing is the one that I think is the worst thing I've ever written ever, and I don't know why anyone pays me to do this. And then oddly, the book that I published that's out, I think is the best because it's beautiful and polished and everything. But then I'm also like, I don't really go back and reread my books either, or I haven't so far.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And then what about a comfort book or a favorite book? Do you have one that you sort of go to?
No, I'm a voracious reader, like all writers are, and I actually just finished reading an early copy of a friend's book that's coming out in March. It's Zarqa Nawaz, who's a Muslim Canadian TV writer. She's having her fiction debut. It's called Jamila Green Ruins Everything, and it was very, very funny. So I enjoyed that.
Excellent title.
Yeah, but I also love Pride and Prejudice, like Farah. So I do find myself reaching for that a lot.
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. Okay, so thank you so much for the fast five. Farah, I'm going to put you back on the hot seat. For your book, Accidentally Engaged, we have Rena and we have Nadeem, who are falling in love, facing some fairly significant life decisions, and in all of it, trying to win a baking contest. And so my question to you is, when you're looking at something like, here's the romance genre, here's the happy ever after, here's what the readers are hoping for, but here are the issues of self-identity and family dynamics and relationships, and so how did you sort of like marry all of these sort of like deep topics and then lighter sprinkles on top? How did you bake that in your writing up?
How did I bake that? I love that.
I had to. Sorry, I had to go there.
There's altogether too much bread in that book. If I ever,
There's not enough bread in that book.
Yeah, too much bread. If I'm not one to go back and read my books either, but if I did, I think I would gain. Oh, I don't know. So with all, like I set out with my debut, The Chai Factor. I said I wrote it in 2 weeks. Now, obviously, that was my debut. That wasn't the first book I'd written. But I did at the time write books kind of faster than I can now, because being an author has so much more things that you have to do than just writing books. But I set out to write fluffy rom-coms. The Chai Factor was the first time I tried rom-com as opposed to contemporary romance. I was trying darker stuff at first, which I think is ridiculous because I'm not dark. But the first time I tried rom-com. And so I intended to be fluffy. I didn't intend it to have any of that, the depth that kind of found its way in. But I am a person that does look at meaning, at identity issues. It's something that I've always thought about. That, no, I don't want to say struggled, but that's always been something that's been at the top of my mind. What it's like to be a woman in Canada, what it's like to be a second generation immigrant, what it's like to be a Muslim, what it's like to be a person of color. So those kind of themes are going to sneak into my writing, whether I want it to or not. And especially with that first book with The Chai Factor, it it was a difficult period for the way that immigrants were seen in North America, the way that Muslims were seen in Canada and in the US. And so that was at the top of my mind. So those kind of themes kind of came into the book. So I don't think I necessarily thought about how I could marry the two. I intended to write a rom-com. I intended to write the kind of like 90s chick lit that I grew up reading. And then it ended up being, I ended up putting that depth because of my own lived experiences and my own worldview into it.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, right? Like, I think that, and I think it's part of the writer's voice. Like, you know, you pick up a book and you can tell who the person is that's written it, because we can't as writers help but leave pieces of ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah, we're not writing in a vacuum. I wish I could write in a vacuum and just write the thing that I want to write, but it never stays that way because books are really long and you have to fill that so you end up just putting a bit of yourself into it.
That's excellent. That's really well said. Courtney, in The Duke Who Didn't, which is such a cool title, you know, when we were talking about writing and we put pieces in ourselves and all these kinds of things. Now, one of the things that we do as writers as well is world building. And with The Duke That Didn't, or the Duke, sorry, did I get that right? Duke Who Didn't, The Duke Who Didn't. We've got world building within the romance, world building within the relationship, but also the added very cool factor of romance building within a historical context. And so, like, where did you strike that balance between here's my imagination, here's where I'm just going to go off into the story world, and then here's actually where I'm going to pull it back in and sort of leave these little landmarks of things that have actually happened and places that actually exist. Where did you strike that balance?
You know, that's a great question. I think I originally had the idea, or I should say, I feel like all of my books are not just one idea. There's like 7 ideas, and at some point they collide and I'm like, these ideas belong in the same book. And then I have a book. But one of the ideas for this book was a town that has a festival every year that people attend from around the country, and it's fairly famous. And this kind of gave me the idea of having this town where there's this girl who's lived there most of her life and is very, you know, sheltered. And there's a guy who's a duke who has never told anyone he's a duke because he doesn't want people in the festival to treat him any differently. And so he shows up for the festival year after year after year, gets to know this girl, is in love with her, wants to ask her to marry him, but has not actually mentioned his life outside of this festival. And so I have had this idea in my head for a while about sort of what they're doing, you know, and all of this stuff. And then I just started adding ideas to it. And all of the ideas that I added to it, actually, I mean, even the idea of the festival, I have to say, I was based originally on a festival that happens in Britain, and I have forgotten the name of the town that does it. But they have this thing that's called Shrovetide Royal Football, and I think there's a couple other adjectives in there.
What a name! I love it.
And it's this thing that has been happening since antiquity. Like there's records of it happening in the 1200s, where they have this little game and they get together and they play this thing, and every year, you know, the town divides and they fight each other for first place. And it's called Royal because one year, like, some of the princes showed up, and people, it's very violent, people get beat up. So lovely, in other words. So that's a historical thing that happened. And I guess the other historical part that got added into this is sort of my mom's family heritage. She is Chinese, and her family came over to Hawaii starting in the 1880s. And so a lot of times I think what we read about sort of diaspora Asians is very modern. You have people, and it's like it's like my mom came over and now I'm this, you know, I'm the second generation. There's that second generation culture clash, all this stuff. Yeah. And I love those stories. I don't want to disparage them, but they're not mine. And my story is a family story that starts in the 1880s. And it's driven by historical factors in China that drove those first waves of diaspora immigration. And so in writing this story and coming up with this idea for a village that was part Asian in historical Britain in 1880, I wasn't sort of like making things up out of my imagination. I was pulling things from that I knew from family history that I know aren't part of the normal lexicon because we don't talk about it. In the United States, we don't talk about the fact that Chinese people built our railways. And that's how we connected our coasts. And then they sort of disappear from our history for years and years and years, decades. And it's like, what happened to them? Like, where did these people go? I mean, some of them did go back, but like, I mean, there were like 40,000 Chinese people here. What's going on?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And so I wanted to bring in some of that history, some of that deep history of who people are and why they leave the place where they were and what they were doing there and what they were like. And one of the offhand things I did with this book was I made my heroine come from the same ethnic minority background that my mom's grandmother is from, which is Hakka Chinese. And then I suddenly had to find out a lot of stuff about that I didn't know about because my grandmother died when my mom was 4. And so it was both a self-discovery, but I feel like a lot of what went in here was researched, wasn't imaginary, and was just things that I discovered. And I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
So
that's well said. And I, yeah, you know, and I think that's really important when we talk about, for any of the emerging writers who are in the audience, like your family legacy, your lived, like Farah said, your lived experiences. These are things that matter to the world that we exist in. These are the things that are going to shift and change the world to become a better place. And these are the things that, you know, we need to discuss. And family history is research. Family stories is research. So thank you. Thank you very much. Uzma, can I also just pause and say how much I loved all of the stories and the worlds, and I just kind of like want to live and have, well, I'm celiac, so I'd have them over for like gluten-free bakery, but just
absolutely, totally,
right? And the titles, like I am not good at titles, so I'm sort of like, you know, lovely envious of the amazing titles that you all came up with, like Hannah Khan carries on, like come on, oh, so simple and so like perfectly on point. And Uzma, like you did not I don't know if like Farah, you were just trying to write something lovely and fluffy and all of a sudden all of these deeper stuff came in, but you did not shy away from the experiences of people of color, particularly brown people. You did not shy away from the dangers of social media and perhaps the moments we let our emotions get ahead of us. But you know, as writers, like we sometimes fret the likability of our character, right? Like we really want you to like them, and we really want you to stay with them for these 300 pages, you know, we're writing, and you know, and so like when you're talking about Hannah, how did you manage to find that line and that balance between a character and characters who are flawed, but they're still relatable and they're still identifiable, and because we can relate and identify with them, now we like them. So how did you make that magic?
Thanks, Natasha. That's a really good question. I think I was just trying to get to know Hannah through drafts. And I knew that, so Hannah Khan is, you know, You've Got Mail, set in rival halal restaurants, based in Toronto, a very close to Toronto Muslim community. And Hannah is the daughter of, you know, I am telling that sort of second generation immigrant story. And her mother is the one who runs this failing Indian restaurant that's a fixture of the neighborhood, but you know, the taste of the neighborhood's being gentrified. This hole in the wall restaurant just isn't cutting it anymore. And I knew that she, as a young woman, she's 24 years old in the book. She's kind of at the strange crossroads that happens, I think, in your early 20s, when you're like, okay, I'm done school. I did all the stuff that I was supposed to do. Now what? Do I just go find a job somewhere? And, you know, I have all these decisions to make. And then at the same time, I'm not, you know, financially set enough to like move out and start my own life. I'm still living at home, so I'm dealing with family dynamics. And I think that's a lot for a young person to deal with at that stage. I remember being that age and having all of these kind of decisions that were looming ahead of me. And I didn't know, you know, it was that fear of, if I make a wrong mistake here, I'll regret it for the rest of my life, because I was a very dramatic 20-year-old. And so keeping that in mind, when I wrote Hannah, I wanted to, you know, make space for someone who was dealing with a lot, but also has like a big personality. And I think oftentimes South Asians, like just women in general, but specifically women of color, and specifically women who wear hijab, are often seen as these women who are timid and submissive. And I was just going to have Hannah just be this person who's like funny and sarcastic and kind of mean. She's a bit of a brat. She has so many parts in the book where she's just kind of like blurting things out and behaving in a way like she's a bratty little sister. And I remember some readers were like, oh, that's not how a 20 something behaves. And I'm like, that a 20 something year old? She's really like, their comment was she's young, she's like a teenager, and this should be a YA book. And I'm like, listen, I have nieces and nephews, and I have seen them wilding out like this, and that's totally normal because she's still trying to figure out who she is. So I was just trying to write and yet she has, you balance that by giving her other qualities and trying to construct characters who are nuanced, right? So she's a bit of a brat, but she's really close to her sister, and she's very caring towards her mother, and she kind of tries to help and mentor her young cousin. So like, you try to build an entire human being. We're all flawed, we're all awful sometimes and great other times, and yeah.
Well, and I think like in all three of your books, the grounding of these characters and the love they have for family and the passion they have for this thing that they are pursuing, right? I think that's universal. I think for so many of us, like we have those dreams and we're pursuing those dreams, or we have those dreams and we wish we could go back to pursuing them, and all of those questions about family and the line between obligation and honoring and all of those things are just handled so beautifully and sensitively in all of these works. Like to the audience, if you have not read these books, like do yourself a favor and read the books. Perhaps start them early so you're not like Michelle and staying up till 1:30 in the morning on a work day, Michelle. But definitely you will not be sorry for picking up these books. Okay, so we're just going to go quickly to a couple. We've got one audience question here. When you are writing in a historical setting, is it a help or hindrance to do a lot of research into actual events? That's interesting. Well, and I think even with contemporary settings,
I think that's
talking about like what's happening in the world right now. Can we sometimes inadvertently date ourselves in our books if we're too on the nose with what's going on in a current event? Right? What do we think? Uzma, we ended with you, we're gonna start with you. What do you think in terms of like contemporary and historical?
I know, for instance, one of the characters in my book is inspired by a member of my family who I never met. She died before I was born. A great aunt who lived in India and the character of Coco Pala, which is Hannah's aunt who comes and visits from India, is sort of model on her. And specifically, there's a historical tidbit that happened to my aunt. It's sort of become the stuff of family legend, where my aunt did, behaved in a way that seemed very, breaking of sort of conventional wisdom at the time. And I had grown up hearing that story, but I personally didn't do a lot of research into it. I just kind of wrote it. But sometimes I think as writers, like I do get dinged with like, oh, that song wasn't published when your story took place, like by readers and things like that. So I write contemporary mostly. My stories take place in the past 10 years. But even with Aisha at Last, I did make reference to historical facts. So one of the things that I mentioned in Aisha at Last is how in the early 90s, there was basically like a rise in Islamophobia in India, which led to the Babri Mosque attack, where, extremists basically, ripped apart a mosque, and then it led to a lot of rioting. And I remember distinctly being a young child and watching this on CNN, and my family just being like horrified that this was happening in their home country. So I did a little bit of research into that, but I certainly am aware of, the fact that, I'm writing a book that's very plot based, and I need to just kind of keep the story moving. And so that's more of a palette, more of like the background. But I'm sure people are different.
No, that's wonderful. And also, thank you. I'm Guyanese, so when I look at the title, we would pronounce it Khan. So thank you for letting me know it's Han, Hannah Han. Right?
It's
so
Khan. It's like a Khan.
Hun, yeah,
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, we'd be con, right? For
Con,
Caribbean
right, yeah.
people, yeah. Farah, how about you? What is your opinion on this?
So definitely when I'm, one of the reasons why I love writing contemporary is I feel like I don't need to do as much research because I'm writing in my own world. But then I always end up biting off more than I can chew. I tend to like, to like putting, my characters usually have hobbies, like in Accidentally Engaged, it's bread, but I always try to do something just to give them more texture and more life. So that's something I often pick something that's my own hobby, but sometimes I'll be doing research. But even just jobs and what their goals are and stuff. So right now I'm working on a book, a YA book that the character is a math genius. And I am not a math genius. So that's requiring more research and more research that I'm really not enjoying because I have to figure out what all these calculus terms are and things like that. And it's more, not some, I mean, I could just throw calculus words in here and there without understanding them, but I'm trying to get into the frame of mind of how a math genius thinks. What are the way that they would process the world that's different from how I did. So I probably did bite off more than I can chew. So I tend to sometimes say, okay, I'm going to do this topic because it won't be a lot of research. And then as the story progresses, I'm like, wow, this is a lot more research than I wanted to do. So and that's when the draft starts taking longer. Maybe that's why. I mean, even in my first book, in The Chai Factor, the main character was an engineer, and I'm not an engineer. I have an engineer friend who helped me with it, and I still don't understand the engineering bits of the book. Thankfully, she does, so we're good. So that's probably, like, I think that the misconception that contemporary doesn't need a lot of research is yeah, that's just not true.
Well, I super love the fact that your brain goes, what job can this person? I know, engineer. I know, math
Engineer.
genius. Like, let's just pick
know.
the most difficult thing before I have to
And
get
I've
into
had,
it.
like, I'm on my fourth or fifth, like, I taught high school, I was a therapist, I used to do HR. I haven't written people of any of the jobs I've actually had. I should, that would make my life easier. Maybe one day.
Courtney, how about you? Do you ever like sort of go down rabbit holes? I remember,
All
right?
the
Go
rabbit
ahead.
holes. All the rabbit holes.
How
So,
do you have like a rope that you use to like spring yourself out of, or do you just like go down and you look for the rabbit and then he's like, you're late, you're late?
no, so when I first start writing a book, I usually try and set up a timeline. So I know historically what's happening. Like it, is there a war going on? Like these are useful things to know. I try and read, if it's set in Britain, I try and read newspapers that are like within the span of the months that I'm writing the book, so that I have some idea what people are talking about, and what they would be doing. And it also gives you like a sense of like, oh, in this area they had autobuses. I had no idea that they had those at that time. And they're obviously, horse driven. The horses are moving them around, but it's not something I think about on a regular basis. So having those little things sort of like sort of gives things historical flavor. And so do I research historical events? Yes. And then once I'm writing the story, then I always find little things. It's like, wait a second, how is she getting from point A to point B? And then I have to go do research. But I have written a couple of contemporaries, and I have to say, I feel like for contemporaries, particularly these days, when I look at how much has changed between when I wrote my first book and today in our world, I think that you should be thinking of a contemporary. You can't help but date your contemporaries, right? Do they have a flip phone? Do they have a smartphone, right? Are they using, earbuds? Are they like all of these things that didn't exist 10 years ago exist now, and they're going to show up in your books. And so I also think that contemporary authors are doing world building, and they're doing world building maybe less for people who are reading it today, but you're doing world building so that somebody in 20 years is going to be able to read your book and find it, understand where it's coming from, because it's going to be a historical at some point.
Yeah.
Like all of our books are, it's the digital age. They're not going to go off the shelves. Our books are all going to be historicals no matter when you write them. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like, think about that reader 20 years from now who doesn't know how phones work today. Like, we don't know how it's going to change, but you can provide that information. And I mean, not without being intrusive. I mean, you can do it inobtrusively, but just think about building the world that you're in, period, no matter when you're writing.
Well, and there's always the caveat too, right? If you're too specific, I was thinking about, so I have this book and I didn't reference Jesse Smollett except to say he sang the song. And I thought that's fair. I tried really hard not to mention celebrities or fashion brands or anything because you never know. So the book comes out, it was across the floor, it was for young readers. Book comes out, and then 2 years later, Jesse Smollett gets charged with faking a crime. And I was like, really? Like, I thought I would. So you're right. You're always going to date yourself. And then there's always like that balancing act too of like, do I want to roll the dice? Like, I think I'm okay to mention Mr. Rogers. I think I'm okay to mention Tom Hanks. Anyone else?
Right.
It might be a little bit of, shaky ground. Which actually, but this kind of leads me into the question of like the romance genre in general, because, I think sometimes for people who don't read the genre or know a lot about the genre, there are the stereotypes that it's fluffy, it's bodice rippers, it's, I don't know, trivial. And yet, we're talking about relationships, we're talking about identities, we're talking about like all of these sort of important things and being wildly feminist about it, right? Romance traditionally was, written by women for women, for the enjoyment of women. And now that world gets bigger, right? Because now there's men writing the romance and people from queer communities are like, yes, here's my story, by the way. So I'm curious, and Farah, can I start with you? Like, of all the genres in the world, what drew you to romance? What drew you, and then from the romance, what drew you from sort of like the darker romance into the rom-com and all that lovely bread, all that lovely bread?
Oh, the bread. So I've like all writers, as Uzma said, I was a voracious reader my entire life. And and it's funny, I was like, I this is like my fourth career. I don't have a lot of longevity in what I decide to do with my life. And every day, every job I had, at the back of my head, it was like my fantasy was to be an author, but I wasn't like actually writing anything. I literally didn't start writing fiction until 5 years ago, even though in the back of my head I always wanted to. And it wasn't until I started reading romance, like an insane amount of romance. I started reading around 2014, 2015, much more. I mean, I'd always read a bit, but much more than before. And then the stories started coming to me clearer. Then I was like, no, this is enough's enough. Now it's time for me to write. So I started writing romance. I didn't have an idea that I was going to write other genres or anything when I started writing. And I chose romance because those are the books that made me feel the best. Those are the books that warm feeling. And I actually think romance is fluffy because it's comforting and it's optimistic and you want to wrap yourself around it with a big blanket. And that's the kind of feeling I wanted to recreate. Not just for readers, because I was writing just for me at first, just like everybody. I was just seeing if I could, but I wanted to get into that deeper. So that's pretty much why I started with romance. Now, since then, now that I've been writing, I want to branch out into other genres, but I think I'm always going to have that love, that romance plot is always going to be there. There's always going to be a very nice, happy, joyful ending because that's what I want to read. That's what I want in my stories.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Courtney, can I go to you on that one?
Yeah. So I think that I'm trying to figure out a good way to say this and I can't. I think the fluff is a feature, not a bug. And I, especially over the last 2 years, my appetite for things that are just like the world is depressing and everyone will die is just really low. I don't want to read that. I already know the world is depressing and it does look like people are going to die and they are all over the place. Can you please give me something else? And I think the thing I like about romance, and I think the thing that people often don't get about it as a genre, is that it is not a good book. There's no such thing as a good book where everything comes easily and no one has to work or fight or believe in things. And I think that one of the things I really love about romance is that, and this isn't true for all romances, I should say, but there's the kind that I find myself like falling deeply in love with is the romance where the character is trying to do something and discover who they, it becomes not just about doing something, but they discover like this identity thing, that it's something that sets a fire in them to do something, not just do something, but do something good and make a difference and make the world a better place, leave the world a better place. And that's one of the things I love about the genre, is that it's not just about a man and a woman getting together, or a man and a man getting together, or a man and three women getting together, depending on your pick. It's about people forming community and saying, this is what we are to each other, and this is how we help each other out. And I feel like for me, that is, in fact, it gets labeled as fluff. But why is it fluffy for people to get together and decide to save each other? That's not fluffy. That is what we need. So
yeah. Well, and yeah, like my background is psychology, and I left it because there was so much focus on like, why are we broken, which I appreciate, but you know, it's only been the recent years that they've actually talked about, why are we happy, and how do we function, and what are the good things. And so, you know, like, and I agree with you, like the idea that somehow something that is fuzzy, something that is warm, something that is fluffy is then considered less than or trivial is so annoying, because when you look at the scientific studies about what stories do for our brains, and just like the drop in stress levels, the boost in immune systems, like all of these amazing things that happen when we read stuff that lights us up. I don't know why we want to be derogatory about books that people love. Like if you love it and it lights you up to read it, to write it, like go, you know, go. Because I'm with you. The world is on fire. You know, someone please pass me the marshmallows in the form of this really lovely book, right? Uzma, what do you think?
I think both answers are so great. The only thing I would add is that I'm increasingly interested in seeing all the places where people who have not traditionally been represented can fit into this genre. And I know Farah and Courtney, you're doing that likewise, and you're putting that on the page, and I appreciate that so much. So I'm interested in that. And I think what brought me to this genre is because I grew up like you, Farah, like reading those 90s rom-coms, right? Like the Bridget Joneses and the Sophie Kinsellas and like all of that sort of stuff. That's why I came here, but I think I'm staying because I feel like I would like to contribute to a different perspective on what romance is, who it's for, who gets represented, who gets the happy endings, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah.
No, that's beautiful. Okay, so we've got a question, and I'm just double checking. Okay, so the question is, with your afterwards and the author notes. So the question was, what are the cool facts you discover that don't make it into the afterword, which you would like us to know? So was there anything? Because you know that's actually a really great question, because you know, you read these afterwards and you're like, oh wait, it's done. Wait, was there anything that didn't make it into your author's notes that you think, oh shoot, you know, now that I have this space, here's the one thing or 17 things that I really wanted you to know about. Who can we start with? Uzma, can we start with you?
I don't think I did, but sometimes what happens is the book is out in the world and it's published and whatever, and then I wish I'd put something else in the afterword instead of what I actually did. So I guess I have afterword regret sometimes. Like I wish I'd mentioned that, you know, Goga Pala was actually inspired by my aunt. I think that would have been a cool thing to kind of mention. But yeah, but other than that, no, everything I'm leaving it all on the page.
That's fair enough. Farah, how about you?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what I put in my afterwards. I think that as a newbie writer, I was like trying to not to say too much. To go back, I would probably talk similar to what Uzma said, what parts of myself I put there. Like I'm going to give it away now, but in my book that's coming out, oh my God, next week, Heron and Bloom, there's a pet rabbit in there, and that's based on my own pet rabbit. And then other things
Aw.
that I have snuck in there here and there of my own family, mostly just to see my children's delighted face when they get to that, or when they text me, oh my God, you put such and such in there. So those are the little Easter eggs I throw in there. And I think, again, like I said before, we always put a bit of ourselves in our books.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Courtney, how about you?
So my afterwards feel like they're getting increasingly long the longer I write. And at this point, I don't think there are things that I leave out of my afterwards, except if I have forgotten them, in which case I wouldn't be able to remember them to tell you. But yeah, I started from having no afterwards in my first published book, so I was like, nobody wants to hear about that. And then I gradually went from 0 to like a page or two to like now I think I've had like 3,000 word afterwards. I'm like, okay, here
Here's
we
my
are.
novel, and here's a novel that talks about my novel. I think that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is, as I do more research and I move away from standard like historical Britain with upper class white people, the amount of research that I'm doing and the amount that I want to tell people about the background to sort of like, I think the word I'm looking for is, you know, when I first started writing in historical romance in 2010, there would be people would talk about whether we were going to have diverse historical romance, and there would be tons of people who would say, well, they just didn't have people like that back then. And I was like, really? Because I'm pretty sure this globe and it still exists, you know. But like, it was like they, you know, they didn't believe that people like that existed in Britain back then, like back then. And so I think a lot of what I'm doing is sort of believability training. I want people to know that people of color existed back then. And I want to train people to the point where if they read a historical romance and they don't see any people of color, they say, wait a second, everyone here is white. That's not accurate. That's what I want to be doing. So I think part of what I'm doing is just like telling people all the cool stuff I found, but I also think I'm doing some believability training.
Yeah, that's really
I
well
love
said.
that.
I super love that. So I just want to share a comment from one of our participants that said, I love that take. I've had friends ask me about my love of the romance genre, for which I'm eternally grateful to my Aunt Pam for the introduction. And I tell them the good are rewarded, the bad are generally punished. And for the period of this book, the world is not so bleak. The genre gives its readers hope that life isn't such a dumpster fire. So yes, we all want to know that life is not a dumpster fire. I'm just doing a really quick scroll. Catherine, yeah, we're going to come back to the couple of the questions there. But before we sort of, you know, you all touched on something that I think for anyone in the audience, as readers and as writers, is juicy and nourishing, which is the idea of different voices bringing different stories to the table. And I'm someone who will follow you home if you offer me food. So whenever I think about writing and stories and authors, you know, it's like this person, you know, it's like this table of amazing, you know, nutritious and delicious reads. And it's great when it's more than just mac and cheese or more than, you know, like there's the curry and there's a this and there's a that. So when you look at the romance genre, like what are some of your hopes for where we go in the future? What are some of the, you know, we were sort of talking before the panel started about like, what do you bring? What are the fresh takes that you bring to the industry and to stories? And Courtney, I love your believability when you're like, I'm believability training, you know, with Farah and Uzma, it's like, here is life. Here's how we exist. As a matter of fact, just because, you know, this character is wearing hijab, she's not going to be submissive. She's not going to be quiet. You know, like those tropes of the obedient, you know, brown girl who is going to kind of go along with what the family says. You know, like let's have a discussion about that, because you know, I'm a brown girl. I don't know those women. And like, you know, the women I know they are strong and they are opinionated and they will tell you what they're thinking, whether you want to hear it or not. You know, and it doesn't matter if they're wearing the hijab or, you know, my cousins, if they're wearing it or not wearing it, you are going to hear their intelligence. You're going to hear their strength. You're going to hear their feist. So yeah. So where do you see, Courtney, let's start with you. where do you hope we go in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road with romance?
So there's a lot of things I could say there. And I'm just going to stick with one. One of the things that I think has been radically underexplored, and when I say radically, I mean like 0% globally, is romances written by people from non-English speaking countries translated into English. And this is one of those things where, you know, even writers of color who speak English, if you start talking about privilege, it is a lot easier to get published as an English speaking person in a Commonwealth country than it is, you know, it is easier for me to get published in Japanese than it is for Japanese authors writing romance in Japanese to get published, because of the way the publishing industry has been set up over the last handful of decades. And you know, this is true for a lot of countries. I met a woman once from the Netherlands who was writing romances in English because it was the only way that she could get romances published in the Netherlands, is by writing in English, getting it published, and then having it translated. And that's kind of a blow. But when I look at sort of what's happening in the entertainment business right now, like in Hollywood, and not just Hollywood, but like we are seeing this massive thing happening in which people are just really receptive and interested in watching content that is not in English. And I think that's amazing and wonderful. I mean, even before Squid Game, which people are talking about a lot because it's like literally #1, which nobody ever expected. But even before Squid Game, I was seeing people talk about K-dramas and J-dramas and C-dramas and all this stuff. I know that there is a Chinese novelist who has written 3 they are romances, they're sort of epic fantasy romance that are getting published in English in December, and I'm very curious to see how those do. There's sort of a receptive audience for them already because they were adapted into film that people found on Netflix and really liked. So I'm really curious to see how those do, and I would love to start seeing more of that content from around the world, because, you know, this is one of those places where we're getting almost nothing, like zero. The number of romances that have been translated from another language and published in the US, like I don't know, I can't think of any. I can't think of a single one except for these 3 that are coming up, written by this author who people found through Netflix, or I should say that US audiences found through Netflix. Obviously she had a Chinese audience before, but you know, that's one. I want more. I'm hungry for more. I want to see so much more. So that's one place I would love to see things change radically.
Well, and also the idea of different, not just like different kinds of storytelling. So, you know, like we're very like North American storytelling is very like this climax and here we go. But in other cultures, you know, it's like you're gonna sit and they're going to start telling you the story, and it's going to go here, and then it's going to go back here, and it's going to go over here, because you're not meant to just sit there for the 5 minutes and hear the story. You're meant to sit there for the day and listen to the story and listen to like all of the things that filter down to it. And if I can remember the name of the book, I will tweet it out. But there's a great book by and it's academic-ish, but it's about, and if someone knows what I'm talking about, but I think his first name is Michael, but he was talking about how as a person of color, when he came to his master's and he's trying to like do the readings, that there was pushback because how he told the story was not within like a North American framework, and like that also that need for us, you know, and that like you said, Courtney, the hunger, right? We want to hear and we want to learn how to, you know, understand and appreciate and digest different kinds of stories by different kinds of people in different kinds of ways, you know. Farah, go for it. What do you think? What do you think?
I love Courtney's point there. It's not something I would have thought of, but it's something that now I'm aching for it, because I'm thinking about other genres that have, like Fredrik Backman from Sweden and Elena Ferrante in Italy. So other genres are doing it, but romance is not. For what I see for the future, I have a group that I turn to whenever I have a publishing issue, question, joy, whatever, a group of other South Asian, mostly romance authors. And one thing that we always repeat to each other over and over again when we get together is we are not a monolith. We are all very, very different. Some of us are, like, I'm Canadian, the rest are American, but I'm a Muslim, they're Hindus, Sikhs, Bengali, Gujarati, Punjabi. My parents are from Tanzania, so I'm like double diaspora. And that's something that we love, that we all coming from these different backgrounds. But when you look at us, we're all brown romance writers. And that's one thing that I want readers to understand that more, to understand that we are not the same thing. Just because we're writing from a Desi point of view, just because we're drinking chai in our books, that doesn't mean that every family is the same. That doesn't mean that all the parents are going to be very, very conservative. Doesn't mean there's going to be arranged marriage. Doesn't mean any of that. And it also, there's a difference between whether there is a second generation, third generation. One of the things that I myself am, my parents are immigrants. So, but when I'm writing my YA books, one of the things I consciously did is I wrote it from my own children's perspective. I have 2 teenagers myself. So those my kids in my YA books are the grandchildren of immigrants. And that's a huge difference between how I grew up. Their parents are like me. Their parents are very accepting, very, very liberal minded. There's still cultural parts of how I parent my kids and how the parents in my books parent their kids that are very South Asian, but it's a different experience. And I think readers are starting to kind of see that just because a book has a brown girl on the cover, that doesn't mean it's going to be about an identity crisis or about conservative parents, about sneaking out of your house. That's not what my YA books are about at all. And I want readers to see more and more of that, of the difference, basically the diversity within diversity. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for the future.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Uzma, can you take us home on this question?
I think Farah and Courtney have said so much. I mean, I just concur with what both of you are saying. Just, I love that more diversity, and just kind of getting away from the monolithic storytelling, and also the idea of just kind of like mining the trauma for our audiences. Like, it's okay for us to just have those fluffy stories that don't necessarily have to deal with the generational trauma or anything, like, and if it does, that's great too, but it doesn't have to. Like, it doesn't have to be like, oh well, if you're writing the diverse story, then that means that you also have to talk about your painful childhood and how you didn't fit in, and you felt like an outsider. Like, let's not do that.
Yeah, that's well said. That's well said. Okay, so we have one final question, and then just another comment. The linear seems to be Western European, as within the First Nations and Indigenous framework, the storytelling is not so linear, but it is almost told in a spiral. So beautifully said. Thank you so much. So here the question is, can I end us on a steamy question? Whether the characters barely touch each other through this book or disrobe in the forest behind the house, is it hard to create the sexual tension? That is, do you have to work hard to get the sparks? So that is a steamy, that's a very, thank you. That's quite the question to ask. I like it. Who would like to answer that one first?
I can go. I don't think I'd be writing romance if I didn't find writing that chemistry kind of like the easy part. I write closed door, so in my adult books, the characters are having sex, but it's not on the page. In my YA books, the characters are also having sex, but again, it's not on the page. And what I'm finding interesting is the reader, I find it hilarious, but the reader response think that my adults book doesn't have enough sex and my YA books has too much sex, which you can't please everybody. But so I spend a lot of time making sure that the chemistry does increase over the course of the story. Again, I don't have an issue writing the chemistry. I tend to have lots of those little stolen touches and looks. I usually have to tone it down a bit after my first draft, because they're like giving each other like those looks in chapter 1 and it's too soon. So if anything, it's almost like I could write the whole book of just like stolen hand holding or looking across the room or admiring someone's cheekbones or forearms or something. So the whole book could be that if I wanted it to. But so I don't find it as something difficult. It is something that I know that other people need to focus on more, but that's the easy part for me.
Oh, well said. Well said. Uzma, how about you?
So in both of my books, there's actually I'm the opposite. So there's not a lot of touching at all. Like it's very like G-rated almost, and I did that very deliberately because I was trying to sort of present the sensuality of wanting and just like present this reality for these my characters are very they're Muslim as well, but they're probably more conservative, and so they don't there's no sex in my books there, but there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of sensuality, there's a lot of like longing glances, some touching, and it's hard to write sometimes because sometimes it's like they should just like jump into bed together, they should just kiss, but the restraint almost is like it's like a real restraint on my writing, and it of course it in that sense, like in my first book, my main character is like a very conservative Muslim man, and he like he says in the book, I'm a virgin, and yet readers were like, oh my god, that book was so hot, because he wanted, like there was so much wanting in the way that he dealt with the lustful feelings that he had for Aisha, the main character, but it is I enjoy writing that, but I do find that I have to be a little creative about the way that I get these characters to interact.
Oh, that's beautifully said. That's beautifully said. Courtney, how about you?
I think I have found that if I'm having difficulty writing those moments of chemistry and connection, that I have something wrong with my characters that I need to fix. Like sometimes they just do not click, and that is not a you can force it kind of thing. It's a all right, step back, someone's got to change moment. And once I have the characters right, it writes itself.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really well said. Okay. Oh, look at that. So we are just a couple minutes over our 8 o'clock. And I know for Courtney, I'm not sure where you're based. I know Farah and Uzma, it's now 10 o'clock your time. Yes. Is it also 10 o'clock for you, Courtney?
No, I'm in mountain time like you are. So
okay,
it's 8 for me.
All right. So Farah, Uzma, Courtney, thank you so much. This was such a fun panel, and I feel both edified and educated. And I don't think I'm the only person here who's gonna walk away feeling like a little bit on cloud nine and fluffy in the very best way. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for joining us. I appreciate the wonderful questions that you sent. And Jeff, thank you for being in the background there and making sure that all the tech worked. Michelle, with thanks, can I turn it back over to you?
Yes. The steamy question was mine, of course. But it was also because I just finished reading Uzma's book, and yeah, those moments of just like accidentally touching hands was very steamy. And I read Dooku Didn't a couple of weeks ago, and that was also like equally steamy, but in a more explicit way. So thank you so much. I was so determined to have a romance panel as part of Starfest and to give the genre its due, and this was a fantastic evening. Lots to think about. I don't have much more to say. Thank you so much, Natasha, for like jumping right into this. So I'm just going to do a few little thank yous to our sponsors. Thanks again to Jeff, who was keeping an eye on things. Our main funders are the City of St. Albert, Friends of the St. Albert Public Library, Alberta Foundation for the Arts, the Canada Council for the Arts, and our media sponsors are St. Albert Gazette, T8N Magazine, and Edify Magazine. For the attendees, you will be getting a survey at the end of the festival, and that gives you a chance to win a set of the Starfest books, like all the books, which will include these 3 authors as well. And definitely, if you haven't read the books yet, read the books. It is nice to read something that has a nice ending. especially, in these times. Our next event is Friday evening, and it will be Omar Mualem being interviewed by Zain Belgi discussing his new book, Praying to the West. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Farah, Uzma, Courtney, and Natasha. We're overdue for lunch as soon as COVID lets us. And I'm going to say goodnight to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you for
everyone.
having us.
Thank you. Thank you. This
Bye.
was fun.